I never had any idea that I'd go into philanthropy. I grew up on a farm. I made a vow to myself at an early age one day, digging a ditch in cold weather to drain some water off someplace where it accumulated, that I would not spend the rest of my life working on a farm. And, I probably gave up a lot in doing that. I have nostalgia sometimes for my old Ford tractor and my plow and being on the farm, but I made a vow to leave the farm. Like a lot of people, my first experience with philanthropy was simply putting money in the collection box, putting money in my envelope and in the collection box on Sundays. I did experience philanthropy when our house burned when I was 7 years old, and people began contributing things, and there was a sense of community around that. I remember that really well, but I never had any idea. Of course, it wasn't organized. It was just disorganized, community philanthropy, disorganized. There was no nonprofit organization. People brought things everywhere to the church, to the Legion Hall, et cetera. And then I decided to become a teacher and to teach English and to have an impact on the next generation, the way they thought about things, the way they wrote, et cetera. And I fell into, being an administrator at the age of 26. I was called on to take up an administrative role. And then all of a sudden, I was called upon to work with those people in the community to put together money for a building. When I began working with those people on raising money, it really caused me to start thinking about why were people doing this, that is, raising the money? What motivated them to get together on Fridays, every Friday at noon, and report to each other on how much they'd gotten together? And what was motivating the people on the other side to actually give the gifts? That was in 1970. I became fascinated with that. I became an administrator, a vice president and academic dean of a community college in Missouri, and we started raising money to build some buildings because we couldn't get bond issues passed. And then I got my first job in development, of course, and really began asking serious questions about it. In fact, I went to the marketing faculty in the Kelley School at the time and asked them if there was anybody who could help us try to understand why people were doing this. I had an early fascination with trying to understand this better. And while I was raising money, it was always in the back of my mind about why was this going on? I met Hank Rosso, of course, and he taught me that you could raise a lot more money with organized fundraising than disorganized fundraising. And I learned something about motivations there because one of the guys who taught in that program was a psychologist. But I still didn't do anything about it until the 1986, 1987, when we started to put the center together. Then we began to really try to, that got me starting to examine this. But that's how I got to it. I got to it, accidentally and then tangentially as a foundation executive, as a university administrator, a vice chancellor of a campus. Those are the roles that got me there, staying involved in with this Center on Philanthropy, and then ultimately the School of Philanthropy. I do think it's important to be a good listener, to try to understand things from various perspectives. I believe deeply in a broad liberal arts education, and I've advocated that to my own children. In fact, I was working with my middle son right now, who's got a headhunter after him, and looking at his resume. He has an undergraduate degree in marketing and management from the Kelley School of Business, but undergraduate minors in political science and German. And my son, who's a neurosurgery resident, has an undergraduate degree in zoology and French. And my other son, who's a lawyer, has an undergraduate degree in Chinese and French. And so the broad education just seems to be I think is so important. And so I emphasize to people not just to get caught up in the technical skills, which is why I really like philanthropic studies so much, because people get to understand rationale, background, cultural differences, all those kinds of things. History makes so much difference in terms of understanding what you're doing today. And so I emphasize the importance of staying grounded in those things and not just becoming a technician of sorts in management or fundraising or making grants or whatever. I emphasize those things. And staying grounded in ethical principles about what you do. Asking yourself, checking yourself constantly on ethical principles and rationale, why you're doing things, what motivates you, what your passions are, and working to your passions. Those are the kinds of things I talk to them about. Probably very different from what a lot of other career counselors might talk to them about. I guess some of it's when I see students having success. I mean, recently, my graduate assistant of many years who left me to take a teaching assistantship landed a teaching job at an undergraduate women's college in Massachusetts. Seeing those students blossom, seeing boards turn around, seeing organizations adopt better principles. My own impact on the IU Foundation. There's actually an ethics committee now at the IU Foundation. IU Foundation signed on the principles of good governance that are promoted by independent sector, helping develop things like principles of good governance, helping develop things like the intermediate sanctions. Those things are important to me, meaningful to me in the way we now look as a philanthropic sector in the United States. My own children, my relationship with my wife has been incredibly important. She keeps me grounded. And is very supportive and helpful along the way. I try to be as supportive of her as I can. I'm not sure as I'm successful as she is, and I certainly appreciate her her balance and her willingness to be out of balance and all that. Watching the growth and development of my children, I think those things have been incredibly important. And I think about them all the time, and I know Mary does too. I think that's how our family has grown and developed. That's really important. And then always trying to recognize from where I came the values that helped me be successful from that experience, and never being embarrassed about who I am as a person based on my growing up on a farm. I always say I grew up on the edges of poverty in the 19th century. And that's part of who I am, and I think all those things have been very meaningful to me.